Welcome to the Flight Levels. When I was a new instrument-rated pilot, I have to admit, I didn't fully grasp who was responsible for terrain separation on an IFR departure. When I did my training, it was all in Florida, and we didn't exactly worry about terrain there. It wasn't until I became a controller at Denver Center where these rules really came into play. Today, we're going over exactly how these rules work, who is responsible for terrain separation on an IFR departure, and what are your options as a pilot. Let's get to it. If you're enjoying this content, please hit that like button and also subscribe so you don't miss any of my upcoming episodes. It also really helps me continue to make videos like this one. I specifically remember an event training on a radar position. The weather was not great that day, so traffic was pretty light, but I did have an IFR departure off of one of the mountainous airports. I cleared the pilot as filed, climb maintain 17,000, and report airborne on this frequency. So a few minutes later, the pilot calls leaving his current altitude, climbing to 17,000. I replied radar contact. And then a few seconds later, the pilot said something along the lines of, "Hey center, there's a lot of mountains out here. Can you be sure to keep me clear of them?" So that was very confusing to me at the time. So in my dumb trainee brain, I replied, "Roger." Unfortunately, my trainer was less than impressed with that. He quickly keyed up the mic and explained to the pilot that he was cleared as filed, and if he was not already flying the obstacle departure procedure, he should probably start doing that right away. My trainer later explained to me that had this pilot crashed, the NTSB would have had a field day with my reply of "Roger," because it could have easily been interpreted as the affirmative that I'm now going to take responsibility for the pilot. Unfortunately, it is far too common that pilots always assume that controllers have responsibility for terrain and obstruction clearance on departure. That's not always the case. Above all, the pilot is in the airplane. Even if ATC technically has obstruction clearance responsibility, you are still the pilot in command. You are the meat and bones flying around in the airplane. As my good friend likes to remind me, if the pilot screws up, the pilot dies. If the controller screws up, the pilot dies. A few caveats as we get started. For every IFR departure we're covering today, you are expected to, after takeoff, climb to at least 35 feet above the departure end of the runway, continue climbing on runway heading until 400 feet above the departure end of the runway, and then continue climbing at the standard climb gradient of 200 feet per nautical mile. So let's talk about the exact circumstances when a controller is responsible for terrain clearance and when a pilot is responsible for terrain clearance. A controller is responsible for terrain clearance anytime they assign you a departure procedure, an obstacle departure procedure, a heading, or you're cleared direct any fix. On the other hand, the pilot is responsible for terrain clearance anytime your clearance off the ground is as filed. This responsibility ends anytime the controller issues you a heading, direct to a fix, or upon you reaching any assigned altitude. Let's take a look at a classic example. Let's say you filed IFR from Montrose, Colorado to Steamboat Springs, Colorado via direct. Upon receiving your clearance, Denver Center clears you via as filed, climb maintain 17,000, departure frequency 125.35, squawk 4215, clearance void if not off by 2015, time now 2010 Zulu. Since you filed direct and you were cleared as filed, does the controller at Denver Center expect you to take off and then turn directly to Steamboat Springs? Not exactly. What it does mean is the controller has blocked all the airspace from the surface up to 17,000 all around the Montrose Airport. Now, if you have the performance to take off and turn direct Steamboat Springs and you know that will clear all terrain, that's completely your discretion. If you feel compelled to fly the published obstacle departure procedure, that's your discretion as well. Are you personally familiar with the terrain around the Montrose Airport and you want to fly some other customized path to remain clear of obstacles? Go for it. The point is that below 17,000 feet, in this instance, the controller does not care which way you go. Once you reach 17,000 feet, which is your assigned altitude, now the controller cares and the terrain clearance is their responsibility. Now, depending on the traffic around the Montrose Airport, the controller may assign you the Montrose obstacle departure procedure. In this case, the controller is taking responsibility for terrain clearance. They may do this to keep you separated from other traffic in the area. Let's take a look at this from the radar controller's perspective. Their main tool to keep you above terrain is the use of minimum IFR altitudes. These are polygons displayed on the video map, and the numbers on these give at least 2,000 feet of separation between you and the highest terrain within the polygon. Now, pilots can't fly above these minimum IFR altitudes all day long. They obviously need to climb up through them during climb and descend through them during descent and landing. For takeoffs and climbs, the controllers have the following options. The controller can clear the pilot as filed while also assigning an altitude that is at or above the minimum IFR altitude along the route of flight. The controller can also force the pilot to fly a published obstacle departure procedure or conventional standard instrument departure. A third option available at some airports is called a diverse vector area. These allow controllers to assign headings immediately off departure at some airports. These can be a bit tricky. While diverse vector areas put clearance on the controller, it is the pilot's responsibility to know if there are any non-standard climb gradients required for any diverse vector areas at the airport you're departing from. For example, at Monterey, California, depending on which runway you are departing, you may be required to climb at a climb gradient of 370 feet per nautical mile up to 2,800 feet. This, of course, is steeper than the standard climb gradient of 200 feet per nautical mile. If your IFR clearance off the ground consists of a heading or a published procedure, air traffic controllers accepting responsibility for your terrain clearance. However, it is your responsibility as pilot in command to understand if there are any non-standard climb gradients required of either the procedure or the diverse vector area. Let's jump back to the other scenario where ATC is going to clear the pilot as filed. This, of course, puts terrain and obstruction clearance back on the pilot. Let's go through the different ways you as the pilot can ensure that you are safely above the terrain on your IFR departure. If the airport you're departing from does not have any published instrument approach procedures, nor any published obstacle departure procedures, then you are quite literally on your own. The FAA simply does not have enough resources to do an obstacle evaluation at every single airport in the United States. Therefore, if you find yourself wanting to depart IFR from one of these airports, it is completely up to you to decide if it is safe to do so. Remember, when you do this, the obstacle clearance is your responsibility all the way up to your assigned altitude. I highly suggest not departing under IFR unless the weather is good enough that you'll be able to see and avoid all potential obstacles. Next, the FAA has guidance for airports that have at least one published instrument approach procedure, but no published obstacle departure procedure. Let's take a look at Melbourne, Florida, for example. We can see they have several instrument approach procedures. They even have a standard instrument departure, but they don't have any obstacle departure procedures. In this case, you can be assured that the FAA has completed an obstruction evaluation. You can depart using what are called the diverse departure rules. This means so long as you follow the standard procedures of taking off and then reaching 35 feet at the departure end of the runway, climbing on runway heading to 400 feet above the departure end of the runway, as well as continuing to climb at the standard climb gradient of 200 feet per nautical mile, you are assured obstacle clearance for at least 25 miles from the airport. This brings us to the circumstance you will find at most of the airports you're going to fly IFR in and out of, which is having a published obstacle departure procedure. Whether textual or graphical, flying this procedure will ensure obstacle clearance on your departure. And a quick reminder, obstacle departure procedures exist purely for departing an airport and clearing obstacles, whereas a conventional departure procedure exists for both obstacle clearance and streamlined air traffic procedures. When cleared as filed, you do not need permission to fly an obstacle departure procedure. On the other hand, you must receive an explicit clearance to fly a conventional departure procedure. So if you would like to fly one, be sure to have that included in your clearance from the controller. We've covered a lot of ground today, but I want to make sure that you come away with this. If your IFR clearance consists of as filed, the terrain and obstruction clearance off the ground is entirely up to you all the way up to your cleared altitude. I highly suggest flying an published obstacle departure procedure if one exists, but that's entirely up to you. On the other hand, if your clearance consists of a departure procedure or a heading, then ATC is assuming obstruction clearance, but it's also conditional upon you flying the required climb gradient if it's higher than the standard climb gradient of 200 feet per nautical mile. So be sure to look up what that might be before accepting an IFR clearance. Have you ever had an ODP assigned to you by air traffic control? If so, let me know in the comments. If you enjoyed this video and want to learn more about the inside world of air traffic control, be sure to like this video, share it with your friends, and hit that subscribe button so you don't miss my next video. Be sure to check out flight-levels.com, and remember, don't just fly, climb to the flight levels. If you enjoyed this video, click here to see my video on how an air traffic controller retirement works. You're gonna love it.